This link is for 15 worlds looking through a scientist's microscope. If you go ahead and make the textbook is open to page 740 and 741. Of course, before we read the story, I'd like to unit itself. We have specimens. Are items or parts typical of a group. Erupted. Erupted means forced out or something that is murky is too dark or cloudy to see through clearly. Dormant. Something that is dormant is quiet or not active for a period of time. Things. Scored, if so, warned away. Research, learn facts about a subject. Observer, a person who watches in a close and careful way. Simple living organism that made up of one or more chlorophyll, usually existing as lower order plants that do not have stems or leaves. Lichens, an organism made of fungi and algae growing together, usually found on or rocks and on the ground. And of course, bacteria. It's a tiny one-celled organism that can only be seen through a microscope. Okay, with that being said, let's go ahead and direct our attention to what the genre is this week. This week, the genre is nonfiction. And remember that nonfiction gives information about real people, places, events, and situations. And remember that this week's comprehension strategy is sequencing. We're going to use the sequence chart to help ourselves see that occur in this story. Just remember that a sequential structure presents information in time order. A good reader looks for time, phrases, and dates as they read so they know how things go in order. With that being said, let's go ahead and begin reading the story. Of course, the story is Hidden Worlds, Looking Through a Scientist's Microscope. It's by Stephen Kramer. Graphs are by Dennis Kunkel. Becoming a scientist. Dennis Kunkel grew up in Iowa's countryside, where cornfields stretched for miles in all directions. Dennis helped tend the flowers and vegetables in the family garden, and he went on weekend fishing trips with his parents and his sisters, and he took care of the family pets. Dennis loved nature and being outdoors, but he did not know that someday he would be a scientist. Then, Dennis received a gift that changed his life. When I was 10 years old, my parents gave me a microscope for Christmas, he recalls. It came with a set of prepared slides, things like insect legs, root hairs, and tiny creatures called protozoans. As soon as I unwrapped the microscope, I forgot all my other presents and tried to figure out how to use it. Okay, I'm going to stop right there real quick. How did Dennis's hobbies contribute to his interest in the microscope? How did Dennis's hobbies contribute to his interest in the microscope? Well, Dennis loved nature and spent a lot of time tending his family's gardens and pets. Now the microscope helped Dennis take his interest in nature a step further. It allowed him to see the things he couldn't normally see when he interacted with animals and plants around him. Let's continue to read. Now the prepared specimens that came with the microscope were dead. Dennis quickly discovered that it was more fun to observe things that were alive and moving, so he began to take collecting trips. One of Dennis's first trips was to a pond about 1.5 miles away from his house. I started hiking there with my little collecting bottles and bringing back water samples to look at it under my microscope, he explains. I couldn't wait to get home before school from school in the afternoon so I could go to the pond. Before long, I was looking at all kinds of fascinating creatures. Now, do you think Dennis Kunkel showed the characteristics of a good scientist as a boy? Do you think Dennis Kunkel began showing good characteristics of a good scientist as a boy? Well, Dennis is very curious, which is one of the characteristics of a good scientist. He soon realized that it was more interesting to examine things that were alive, and so he started making trips to a pond to collect samples. Dennis used the microscope to look at anything he could under its lenses. He examined insects, soil samples, and parts of plants. He looked at fur from his pets and seeds from a nearby field. Dennis made drawings of things he observed, and he spent many hours reading about them. After Dennis graduated from high school, he enrolled in a junior college in his hometown. A biology teacher there encouraged his love of science and microscopes. Dennis often worked in the science lab after school, using microscopes to study the things he collected. Then, Dennis transferred to the University of Washington in Seattle, and finally he could learn and do things that he dreamed about. I had to work in labs with good microscopes, explained Dennis. I spent hours speaking with professors and students about science. I had dreamed of exploring and learning about undersea life like Jacques Cousteau, but until I left Iowa, I had never even seen the ocean. While I attended the University of Washington, I learned how to scuba dive. It was thrilling to go underwater to observe and collect the plants and animals I wanted to study. I'm going to stop right there. If you look in those 3 paragraphs that we just got done reading, what clue words does the author use to indicate the time order of events in Dennis Kunkel's life? Look for some of those clue words. Well, some of the words are after, then, and finally. This indicates the sequence of events in Dennis's life. So after he graduated from high school, Dennis entered a junior college where he studied biology. Then he transferred to the University of Washington, where he was finally able to work in labs with good microscopes. Okay, so with that being said, let's go ahead and fill in our sequence chart, that first section here. We're going to say here, after high school, and Dennis went to junior college and worked in after that. Then Dennis transferred to the University of Washington. And then finally, he was able to work in labs. So let me fix that was. With good microscopes. Okay, with that being said, let's keep reading. Now, in graduate school, Dennis began to use the science department electron microscopes for research, studying tiny living things called cyanobacteria. But Dennis also used the microscope to help other scientists. He helped one of his professors study and classify pollen grains from different kinds of flowers. He helped a few graduate students examine wood with an electron microscope to learn how plant cells deposit minerals and create hard wood. He helped other students with studies of algae, fungi, and flowering plants. After 8 years of graduate work, including thousands of hours to research on microscopes, Dennis earned excuse me, a PhD in botany, the study of plants. Although Dennis was finishing his schooling, he was just beginning a lifetime of scientific learning and discovery. Dennis worked on research projects at the University of Washington and the University of Hawaii for about 25 years. And now, he does much of his work in his home on the island of Oahu, Hawaii. Working as a scientist. Now, scientists are explorers. They usually make discoveries by asking questions and answer them. Some scientists find their answers in laboratories surrounded by equipment and instruments, and others travel to natural areas to find their answers. Dennis' work had taken him to mountains, rainforests, deserts, caves, beaches, and into the sea. Now, whenever Dennis goes on a field trip, he takes along collecting boxes and bottles, and when he returns to the lab, the boxes and bottles are usually full of interesting specimens: algae, lichens, mushrooms, seeds, leaves, insects, bark, soil, and flowers. Now, Dennis has explored hidden worlds in places ranging from the blast zone of a volcano to the dust balls underneath people's beds. I'm going to stop right there. Why are the places Dennis explores called hidden worlds? Why do you think the places that Dennis explores are called hidden worlds? Well, Dennis collects specimens from natural areas and uses the microscope to observe the things that are actually hidden from the naked eye. Mount St. Helens. Now, in 1980, a dormant volcano called Mount St. Helens erupted in Washington state. The blast from the eruption flattened huge forests of tall trees. Floods of boiling mud and water from melting snow scoured riverbeds, and the countryside was covered with a thick layer of ash for miles around. Now, some of the first people allowed to visit the blast zone were biologists, scientists who were studying living things. They were stunned by the destruction. One of the first things they wanted to know was whether or not any living things had survived. So a team of scientists from the University of Washington made plans to study the lakes and streams of the blast area. Now, since Dennis was an expert in algae, the simple plant found in lakes and streams, he was invited to help with the study. The scientists traveled to a camp set up on the north side of Mount St. Helens, and twice a day a helicopter flew them into the blast zone. All they could see for miles in every direction were dead trees blanketed by a heavy layer of ash. Now the scientists were thrilled because they had never explored the area around an active volcano. So soon after this type of eruption, but no one knew when the mountain might erupt again. In fact, no one even knew for sure whether it was safe to land a helicopter in the blast zone. Some pilots thought the ash stirred up by the wind whirling helicopter blades might choke the engines. So Dennis and the other scientists weren't allowed to land in the area on the first few trips. They had to collect their water samples while the helicopter was actually still in the air. Now I'm going to go ahead and stop right there. That's going to conclude this portion of the link, and then we'll pick up in part 2.